Maggie pressed the button on the coffee machine, watching the dark liquid drip slowly into the mug, the familiar sound of comfort in her small apartment. The early morning light filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows on the hardwood floor. It was another quiet Saturday, another day of routine that had long since become a reflection of her life. She had stopped counting the years since her divorce. It wasn't so much about numbers as it was about the realization that the pain of it, the heartache, had faded into something like a ghost, present in the background but no longer able to claim her full attention. There had been a time when she had hoped for love again, back when her heart was still open, raw, and ready for anything. But now, love seemed like a concept meant for someone else, someone younger, someone freer, someone who hadn't been through what she had. Maggie had been 29 when she married Simon, an ambitious man with dreams that were as big as hers. At first, it had felt like they were the perfect match, the kind of couple that made sense, even on paper. He had his career, and she had hers. They shared the same dreams, the same passions for literature, even the same social circles. They talked about children, about vacations they would take, about the future. But, as it often does, life had a way of rearranging things. The cracks in their marriage started to show after a few years. It wasn't one big moment, but rather a series of small ones, 1,000 little misunderstandings, and moments where they no longer felt like they were on the same path. The way he started working late more often, and then the casual comments about her career, how she was too wrapped up in work or not giving him enough attention. She had told herself it was just a phase, that they'd get through it. But one day, he sat her down and said the words she had dreaded but deep down already knew were coming. Asterisk, I think we've grown apart, Maggie. We want different things now. Asterisk. That was the moment when everything shattered. Her world, built on the belief that love was a constant, a foundation to everything else, crumbled around her. It wasn't just the divorce itself. It was the loss of the future she had imagined with Simon, the life they had planned, the idea that love would always be a safe place to return to, no matter what. After the divorce, Maggie threw herself into work. She was a book editor, and it was an easy escape. There was always something to do, always another manuscript to read or another meeting to attend. She could hide behind the pages, losing herself in the lives of other people, in the characters she edited, who were often more real to her than her own. It wasn't healthy, but it was the easiest way to keep the ache of loneliness at bay. Over the years, her routine became a comfort. She had a small circle of friends, some from work, others she had known for years, but it wasn't the same. They had moved on with their lives. Some were married with children, others had their own partners, and Maggie found herself withdrawing more and more from them. She had convinced herself that she was happy, content even, with the life she had built. It wasn't that she didn't long for companionship, but the idea of opening herself up to someone else again seemed like a betrayal to the person she had been before. A part of her still mourned the woman who had once believed that love could last forever, that it was the thing that made everything else worth living for. The silence in her apartment on Saturday mornings had become comforting, almost sacred. She didn't need anyone else to fill the space. She had books, a steady job, and her own company. She liked it that way. It wasn't lonely, not really. But as she sipped her coffee that morning, Maggie couldn't deny a lingering thought, one that had been growing in her mind for the past few weeks. Was this really all there was to her life now? She set her mug down and glanced at the clock. It was time to go to the office. Not for work. She didn't have anything pressing at the moment, but for a meeting with a new writer she had agreed to mentor. The young author, Carla, had recently finished her first novel and was seeking advice on how to navigate the world of publishing. Maggie was surprised to find herself interested in the project. There had been a time when she had been passionate about helping others find their voices, about sharing the joy she had in the written word. Maybe this would bring something new into her life, a spark of excitement she hadn't felt in a long time. The meeting was at a small cafe in the city, a place Maggie had frequented for years. She arrived early, as usual, and took a seat by the window. The cafe had the same cozy, familiar feel it always had. Wooden tables, soft jazz music playing in the background, and the faint smell of fresh bread in the air. Maggie liked it here. It was quiet enough to work, yet lively enough to feel like she was still part of the world outside her small bubble. She wasn't sure what to expect from Carla. The young woman had sent a few emails with updates on her novel, but they hadn't gone into much detail. Maggie wondered if the book would be any good, if it had potential. She wasn't sure why she had agreed to take on this mentoring role, but a part of her was curious to see if the act of guiding someone else could reignite a spark she had long since put out. Carla arrived a few minutes late, her blonde hair slightly tousled, and she seemed out of breath, as if she had been rushing through the city. When she spotted Maggie, she smiled brightly and apologized for being late. "I didn't mean to keep you waiting," she said, settling into the seat across from Maggie. "No problem," Maggie replied, giving her a warm smile. "I'm just glad we could meet." They spent the next few hours talking about Carla's book, her aspirations, and her writing journey. Maggie found herself impressed by the young woman's enthusiasm and raw talent. Carla had a way with words that felt fresh and honest, and Maggie could see the potential for something truly special. It was refreshing to speak with someone who still believed in the power of words, in the possibility of creating something that could touch others. But it was when the conversation turned to more personal matters that Maggie's attention was piqued. Carla began talking about her love life, or rather, her lack of it. "I don't know," Carla said, shrugging her shoulders. "I feel like I'm too focused on my writing to make room for someone else. I guess I've kind of given up on the idea of love." Maggie felt a pang in her chest, an unfamiliar ache that reminded her of her own past. "It's never too late for love," Maggie said, though the words felt strange coming from her mouth. She hadn't believed that in years, but for some reason, she found herself saying it. Carla smiled softly, but there was a hint of skepticism in her eyes. "Do you really think so?" Maggie hesitated. She wanted to tell Carla that love was possible, that it wasn't about timing but about connection. But the truth was, Maggie wasn't sure anymore. She had convinced herself that she was better off alone. The world of romance seemed like a distant, unattainable dream for someone like her. But looking at Carla, seeing the way she still believed in love, made Maggie wonder if maybe she had been wrong all along. As they parted ways, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that something inside her had shifted. She wasn't sure if it was hope or just a fleeting thought, but as she walked back to her apartment, she realized she had been living in the past for far too long. Perhaps it was time to open herself up to the possibility of something new, something she had closed herself off from long ago. But she wasn't ready to admit it yet, not fully. Not until she figured out if she was really ready to risk her heart again. The quiet life was comfortable, but Maggie wasn't sure if it was enough anymore. The next few weeks passed in a blur for Maggie. Her routine, which had become so ingrained in her life, remained largely unchanged, but something felt different, subtle yet undeniable. It wasn't a sudden transformation, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized that meeting Carla had sparked something inside her, a small flicker of possibility. She still wasn't sure what exactly that possibility meant, or what she was supposed to do with it, but she couldn't ignore the fact that her life felt quieter now, more stagnant. She hadn't felt any real sense of excitement in a long time. It was a Saturday morning, almost a month after the meeting with Carla, when Maggie decided to break the routine. She was on her way to the bookstore, the one place she often visited to get away from the endless grind of editing. As much as she loved the comfort of her apartment and her quiet life, she realized she hadn't really been out of her small circle of habits for a while. She needed a change, something new to bring her out of the fog of monotony that had been clouding her thoughts. The bookstore was a place that always made her feel at home, a sanctuary where she could lose herself in the pages of novels and forget about the world outside. But this time, instead of heading straight to her usual section of literary fiction, she found herself meandering through the aisles in search of something she hadn't expected, something that might offer an escape, something unexpected, or maybe even something a little challenging. After a few minutes of aimless browsing, Maggie's eyes landed on a section of local authors. She had never paid much attention to it before, but today, the idea of exploring new voices intrigued her. There, Nestled among a stack of hardcover books, she noticed a name that stood out: Daniel O'Connor. The cover was simple, not flashy, but it exuded an understated charm. The title was A Quiet Life, a phrase that immediately resonated with Maggie. It was odd, but she found herself picking it up, thumbing through the pages, and glancing at the back cover. The blurb caught her attention, a reflection on the power of rediscovery, a tale about starting over when life seems too far gone. It wasn't the kind of book she would have picked up a few months ago, but something in her felt drawn to it. She paid for the book and left the store, her mind already buzzing with the idea of diving into this new narrative. That afternoon, Maggie sat on her balcony with a cup of tea and began reading. The book's narrative was gentle, a reflection on the life of a man in his mid-50s who, after the death of his wife, began to question everything he had once known. It felt raw, real, and surprisingly comforting. It was like reading her own inner thoughts, the doubts, the fears of being too old, too set in her ways, too far removed from the idea of finding love again. As she turned the pages, Maggie felt a connection to the protagonist, a man who had convinced himself that he was past his prime, that there was no more room for new experiences or new love. By the time she reached the final pages, Maggie was so immersed in the story that she almost didn't notice the time slipping away. She realized, with a start, that she had read the entire book in one sitting. It was late afternoon now, and though the book had ended, its themes lingered in her mind. Why did she keep shutting herself off from the possibility of a new life, of new love? She asked herself. The next morning, Maggie woke up with a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in ages. She didn't know what had changed overnight, but she could feel the pull to do something different. She had spent so many years in the safety of her own solitude, in the bubble she had created to shield herself from pain, that the thought of stepping out into the unknown, into something that could lead to a life beyond what she had known, felt both thrilling and terrifying. But it was time. She knew it now. Maggie had met Daniel, the author of the book, a local literary event a few years back. He had been standing at a table signing copies of his first novel, and they had exchanged a few polite words about the writing world. She had been struck by his quiet demeanor, his thoughtful responses, and his easy charm. At the time, she had thought little of it. He was just another author, and she was just another editor. But as the months went by, and his book had gained modest success, Maggie began to wonder about him again. She hadn't seen him since that brief encounter, but now, with his words in her hands, she felt an undeniable curiosity. The next time Maggie went to a cafe near her apartment, she was surprised to see him sitting alone at a corner table. She wasn't sure if it was fate or just coincidence, but in that moment, her hesitation melted away. She walked over to him, her steps tentative but resolute. He looked up from his book, and a smile spread across his face. There was a familiarity between them, a recognition that transcended their previous brief meeting. "Daniel, right?" Maggie asked, her voice a little nervous. "We met at a book signing a while back." He looked at her for a moment before the recognition registered. "Maggie, yes, of course. It's good to see you again." There was a warmth in his voice that made her feel welcome, and before she could second-guess herself, she took a seat at the table. "I've just finished your book," she said, feeling slightly awkward but genuinely wanting to share her thoughts. "It was really moving. Honestly, it felt like you were writing my own life, in a way. The part about feeling like you're too old to start over." She paused, her breath catching for a moment. "It spoke to me." Daniel seemed to pause for a moment, as if considering her words. Then, he nodded, his eyes reflecting a quiet understanding. "It's funny," he said, "I think we all get to a point where we feel like we've missed our chance, like there's no more time for anything new. But in reality, that's when we're often the most open to change." Maggie nodded, feeling her chest tighten. She had never told anyone about how she had been feeling, the overwhelming sense that time was running out for her, that love had passed her by. But sitting here with Daniel, talking about his book and the quiet wisdom in his words, she realized that maybe she wasn't alone in these thoughts after all. "It's funny," she said, her voice quieter now. "I've spent so much time convincing myself that I'm fine on my own, that I don't need anyone. But deep down, I wonder if that's really true. Maybe I've just convinced myself that I'm too old for love." Daniel smiled gently, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "I think we're all capable of learning to love again, at any age. It's not about when it happens. It's about being open to it when it does." For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, the noise of the cafe fading around them. Maggie felt a sense of connection she hadn't expected. It wasn't romantic, not yet at least, but it was something. There was a bond between them, a shared understanding that neither had to say aloud. She didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time in years, she felt the stirring of something new, something exciting. "Would you like to meet again sometime?" Maggie asked before she could overthink it. "Maybe talk more about writing, life, whatever." Daniel smiled, a bit surprised but clearly pleased. "I like that very much." And so, they made plans for another meeting. As Maggie walked back to her apartment later that afternoon, she realized that it wasn't just the book or the conversation with Daniel that had left her feeling different. It was a recognition that despite all the years of convincing herself that love was a thing of the past, there was still a chance for something new if she was willing to take it. The world didn't stop because of her age or the fact that she had once been hurt. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to start living again. The weeks after Maggie's unexpected meeting with Daniel felt like they were slipping by in a haze of quiet anticipation. Every time she thought of him, a small thrill would flutter in her chest, one that she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't the kind of overwhelming, heart-stopping feeling she had experienced when she was younger, back when she had fallen in love with Simon. It wasn't a sense of desperation or need, but something softer, more subtle. It was the beginning of something she hadn't allowed herself to consider in such a long time. Something that wasn't just about missing the idea of love, but the possibility of rediscovery, of learning to open herself up to the world again. Their second meeting was a week after their initial encounter, and it wasn't the kind of date that set Maggie's heart racing with nerves or excitement. It was simple. They met at the same cafe, sat in the same corner, and talked about books, about life, about everything and nothing. Daniel seemed to have an ease about him that made Maggie feel comfortable in a way she hadn't expected. He wasn't pushing her toward anything. He wasn't asking her to be anything other than who she was. But that was part of what made it so disorienting. She was so used to controlling every aspect of her life, managing her emotions, keeping everything neatly in its place. But with Daniel, there was a gentleness that pulled her out of her shell, one that slowly unraveled the layers she had spent years building. As their conversations continued, they discovered more things in common, shared memories of literature, similar tastes in music, even small details about the way they both valued quiet time, moments of solitude in which they could recharge. For the first time in years, Maggie found herself looking forward to their meetings, even as she remained hesitant. She knew there was something between them, some kind of connection, but she was scared. Deep down, Maggie feared that opening up again would expose her vulnerability. What if she got hurt again? What if she let someone else in, only to face the same heartbreak that had shattered her once before? Her thoughts often spiraled in these circles, unable to reconcile the desire to embrace this new possibility with the fear of the past repeating itself. It was during one of their meetings that the conversation veered into more personal territory, a conversation Maggie hadn't expected, but one that felt like it was bound to come. Daniel had a way of asking questions that were gentle but probing, never pushing too hard, but always nudging her just enough to make her confront her own feelings. "I've noticed that you never really talk about your past," Daniel said one afternoon as they sipped their coffee. "I mean, I know we've talked about books, about writing, about the world, but you've never really said much about what led you to this point. I guess I'm curious." Maggie hesitated. It wasn't that she didn't trust him. It was just that there were parts of her past that she didn't know how to explain, parts that still felt raw, too close to the surface. But as she looked at him, she saw no judgment in his eyes. There was only curiosity, not a sense of prying, but of genuine interest. "I guess I've always kept that part of my life separate," Maggie said, her voice quieter than usual. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the words she had avoided saying for so long. "When I was married, I had this idea of who I was supposed to be. I thought love was the thing that made everything else possible. But then, when it ended, it felt like everything I had worked for, everything I thought I knew about myself, crumbled. And I don't know how to say this, but it's hard to believe in it again. Hard to believe in love. Daniel nodded slowly, taking a sip of his coffee. I get that, he said. I think everyone has that moment in life when they stop believing in certain things. Sometimes it's easier to hide behind that wall we build than to face the fear of being hurt again. The words hit Maggie harder than she expected. She knew that Daniel, too, had experienced loss. He had been married for years before his wife passed away from cancer. He had raised children on his own, had faced the solitude of grief, and yet here he was still talking about the possibility of love with an open heart. He had found a way to move forward, and Maggie couldn't help but feel a pang of envy. I don't know if I can do it, Maggie confessed, the words coming out in a rush. I don't know if I can open myself up again. I've convinced myself for so long that I'm better off on my own, that it's safer. And I guess, in a way, I've gotten used to being alone. Daniel's eyes softened, and he set down his cup, leaning forward slightly. I understand the fear. But I think sometimes we convince ourselves that being alone is easier than taking a risk. But I've learned something over the years. I've learned that the risk is part of the beauty. And maybe if we can take that leap, we find something unexpected, something worth all the scars. Maggie blinked, surprised by the depth of his words. She had never really allowed herself to think of love as something that could be beautiful in its imperfections, something that could grow despite past pain. She had always viewed it as something perfect, something that either worked or didn't. But Daniel's words lingered in her mind, and she realized that perhaps she had been approaching love all wrong. It wasn't about finding perfection. It was about being willing to take the risk, to trust that even in the mess of life, there was room for connection, for tenderness. I'm scared, Daniel, Maggie whispered, almost to herself. I'm scared that if I let myself love again, I'll lose myself in it. That I'll lose who I am, or worse, that I'll be left alone again, like before. Daniel didn't say anything at first. He just sat there, watching her with a kind expression. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. You're not going to lose yourself, Maggie, he said. Love doesn't take away who you are. It doesn't erase your history or your identity. It's not about becoming someone else. It's about finding someone who sees you, really sees you, and still chooses you. And in that, you find a deeper part of yourself, one that you might have forgotten or neglected for a while. Maggie felt a lump in her throat, an overwhelming emotion that she hadn't expected to surface. She had spent so much of her life trying to protect herself, trying to avoid the kind of pain that had once consumed her, that she had forgotten how it felt to be truly seen, to be accepted for who she was, not just for her accomplishments or her image, but for the person beneath all of that. And here, with Daniel, she realized that there was someone who could see her, who could understand the fear she had, the wall she had built, and still be patient with her. I don't know if I'm ready for that, Maggie said, shaking her head slightly. I don't know if I'm ready to take that step, to risk my heart again. Daniel smiled softly, a quiet understanding in his eyes. You don't have to be ready right now, he said, but when the time comes, you'll know. And when you're ready, you'll find that there's someone who'll be waiting for you, someone who won't rush you. It's about trusting yourself enough to take that step when it feels right. There's no deadline on love, Maggie. For a long time, Maggie sat in silence, absorbing his words. She had always believed that love came with rules, with expectations, with a timeline that she needed to follow. But Daniel's words felt like a gentle unraveling of those old beliefs, a quiet permission to take things at her own pace. She didn't have to rush into anything, didn't have to force herself to feel something she wasn't ready for. But maybe, just maybe, she could open herself up to the possibility of something new. The rest of the afternoon passed in a quiet, comfortable haze, the kind of time that felt peaceful and unhurried. When Maggie stood to leave, she felt something inside her shift. It wasn't a sudden transformation, but a soft realization that maybe, after all this time, She didn't have to keep running from her past. She didn't have to be afraid of love anymore. She could take the time she needed, move at her own pace, and allow herself to be open to the future. As she left the cafe and stepped out into the crisp evening air, Maggie felt a small sense of hope blossoming within her. She wasn't ready to fall in love yet, but maybe that was okay. Maybe it was enough to simply be open to the possibility. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that love, in all its messiness and unpredictability, was still worth the risk. Maggie's life had always been carefully measured. Her routines were like the clockwork of a well-constructed machine. Each moment accounted for, each decision weighed. The edges of her existence were lined with predictability, and for years it had been enough. But since meeting Daniel, since the quiet, patient unfolding of their connection, something inside her had shifted. The weight of her self-imposed limitations, her years of avoiding the possibility of love, seemed less pressing now. There was a part of her, small but persistent, that wondered what life could be like if she allowed herself to step off the path she had been so sure of for so long. It was early spring when things between Maggie and Daniel began to change. The days were lengthening, the chill of winter slowly giving way to the warmth of sunlight. Their meetings had become more frequent, and there was an undeniable closeness that had developed between them. Maggie found herself looking forward to their time together more than she had anticipated. What began as casual conversations about books, writing, and their respective lives turned into something deeper, something more personal. They would talk about their pasts, their losses, their fears. Each conversation seemed to peel back another layer of the walls Maggie had spent so long building around herself. The connection she felt with Daniel was like a quiet stream, flowing steadily and inevitably, soft but certain. It wasn't long before Maggie found herself questioning something she had never allowed herself to entertain. What if love wasn't something that had passed her by? What if she could open herself to it again? It was a terrifying thought, one that made her heart race with both excitement and fear. She had told herself so many times that she was fine on her own, that she didn't need anyone else to complete her. But Daniel's presence in her life was challenging that belief. His gentleness, his ability to accept her for exactly who she was slowly dissolving the walls she had built over the years. She didn't need him to fix her. She needed him to be there, to be someone she could share her life with, without the pressure of perfection. But the question remained, was she ready to take that leap? It was one late evening in early May when Maggie found herself sitting in the same cafe where they had first met. She had come alone, as she often did when she needed space to think. But tonight was different. The air around her seemed to hum with the weight of her decision. She had been reflecting on her relationship with Daniel for days now, running through the possibilities, weighing the risks. Every time she thought about opening herself up to him, the old doubts crept in. Could she really do this? Could she trust herself enough to love again, especially after everything she had been through? The thought of being vulnerable once more filled her with both excitement and dread. It was then that Daniel walked in, a familiar figure in the doorway, his presence grounding her in a way that she had come to rely on. He spotted her right away, his eyes lighting up as he made his way over to her. The way he looked at her, with such warmth and understanding, always made Maggie feel seen in a way that no one else ever had. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice low and kind. There was something about the way he said it, a softness that told her he was aware of her quiet turmoil, of the thoughts swirling in her mind. Maggie smiled, though it was tinged with uncertainty. "Of course not. I was just thinking about everything about us." Daniel sat down across from her, studying her for a moment before reaching across the table, his hand hovering just above hers before gently resting there. His touch was light, but it sent a warmth through her that was both comforting and electrifying. "What's on your mind?" he asked, his voice calm, as though he had all the time in the world to listen. Maggie took a deep breath, the words she had been grappling with for so long finally bubbling to the surface. "I've been thinking about us," she said, her voice shaky but determined. "About what I'm feeling about what this is." Daniel nodded, giving her the space to continue. And what do you feel, Maggie? She hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to articulate the turmoil inside her. I feel something, Daniel. Something that scares me. It's not just the idea of love, but the idea of allowing someone in again, of letting myself be vulnerable. I've spent so many years building this wall around me, convincing myself that I didn't need anyone, that I was fine on my own. But with you, I feel different. I feel like maybe I could let go of that fear. But at the same time, I'm terrified. Terrified that I'll lose myself again, that I'll open up only to be hurt. Daniel's hand tightened around hers, his expression soft but serious. Maggie, I understand. I know how it feels to be afraid of getting hurt again. Believe-me, Ido. But I also know that when you shut yourself off completely, you miss out on everything else, everything that makes life worth living. I'm not asking you to jump in without thought. I'm asking you to trust yourself enough to take a step forward, even if it's a small one. Maggie felt her throat tighten as she met his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. The vulnerability she had kept hidden for so long felt exposed, raw, but it wasn't as terrifying as she had imagined. With Daniel, she felt like she could take a breath, could let go of the wall she had carefully constructed. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't trying to control everything. She didn't need to have all the answers. She just needed to take that first step. I'm scared, Daniel, Maggie admitted, her voice small but honest. I'm scared because I don't know if I'm ready to let go of the past. But I want to try. I want to try with you. Daniel's smile was soft, almost relieved. You don't have to have it all figured out right now. All we need is to be here together, one step at a time. Maggie nodded, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. For the first time in years, she didn't feel the need to have everything perfectly planned. It was enough to simply be in this moment with him. The days that followed felt different. Lighter, somehow. Maggie and Daniel spent more time together, letting the connection between them grow at its own pace. There were no grand declarations, no rush to define their relationship. They simply enjoyed each other's company, talking, laughing, sharing their experiences, their thoughts. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. It was real, and that was all that mattered. Over the following weeks, Maggie allowed herself to be open to the possibility of love again. She wasn't naive enough to think it would be easy or without risks. She knew that there were no guarantees in life. But with Daniel, she felt a kind of peace she hadn't realized was possible. It wasn't the frantic, all-consuming kind of love that burned bright and fast. It was steady, like the slow, even rhythm of a heartbeat. Then, one evening, as they stood together outside a small art gallery they had visited together, Daniel turned to her, his expression serious but tender. Maggie, I know we've been taking things slow, he began, his voice quieter now, but I want you to know something. I don't want you to feel pressured. I don't want you to feel like you have to be anything other than who you are. But I also want you to know that I'm here and I care about you. I'm ready to see where this goes, whenever you are. Maggie felt a surge of emotion rise within her. She hadn't expected this moment to come so soon, but she realized, in that instant, that she was ready. Ready to take that leap of faith. Ready to trust that love wasn't something that would tear her apart, but something that could make her whole again. I'm ready, Daniel, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm ready to try. And with that simple declaration, something shifted between them. It wasn't an earth-shattering moment, but it was a moment of deep understanding. They didn't need to rush. They didn't need to know all the answers. What mattered was that they were here, together, ready to face whatever came next. Maggie had spent years convinced that love was a thing of the past, something that was no longer for her. But now, as she stood with Daniel, she realized that it was never too late. Love, in all its messiness and uncertainty, could still be a part of her life. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The future was still unknown, but for the first time in years, Maggie wasn't afraid. She had taken a leap, and that was enough. The rest would follow.